This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. You may or may not agree that a bill legalizing adult use of cannabis was the high point of the legislative session. On Tuesday, that bill became law when Governor Lamont signed legislation legalizing recreational marijuana for adults 21 and over. Now, cannabis has been debated for several years in the General Assembly, and even in the final days before its passage, the bill highlighted tensions among state lawmakers and the governor related to Connecticut's focus on putting equity first in efforts to legalize marijuana. Today, Where We Live, we speak to State Representative Robyn Porter, a Democrat who's been a critic of the governor. Her work on an amendment over who gets licenses to grow and sell cannabis led the governor to threaten to veto the bill, but that amendment was taken out, and by the end, the state Senate voted 3 times on the cannabis bill before the legislation passed. Now the state needs to implement legalization, including retail. We're going to talk about next steps and take your questions, too. You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. State Representative Robyn Porter. Again, she's House co-chair of the General Assembly Labor Committee. She's a Democrat and represents parts of New Haven and Hamden. Representative Porter, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Lucy. So happy to be with you this morning.
Now, I watched that ceremony yesterday when Governor Lamont signed this cannabis bill into law. I understand you were not there at the bill signing. Last Friday, you put out a statement saying your conscience was conflicted about this marijuana legalization bill because it was not focused enough on equity. So talk about what you meant. What would you have liked to have seen in this bill before it became law?
Well, I think it was the fact that there was an amendment. So first, I want to thank Senator Winfield for his support and for putting forth the amendment that would have included criminal histories as a qualifier for the social equity definition. And that was important to me because I felt like that would, level the playing field in the way that the bill had been constructed. Not to mention that most of the states that have legalized or municipalities that have done so have actually used that qualifier when it comes to criminal history, which would include either someone who had been convicted, arrested or convicted of cannabis charges, or a spouse, parent, or child. So we led with a place-based definition, and I wanted to have a compromise that included people-based because you don't have community until you have people and families. And there were people and families that were intentionally and maliciously targeted when Nixon decided that there would be a war of what he called on drugs, a war of what I call on Black and poor people. And what they even said was blacks and hippies, not my words, but his advisors' words.
So again, your amendment would have added convictions as a social equity qualifier. So not necessarily tying a person to where they live or lived in this disproportionately impacted census tract area, which is now part of this law, Representative.
That is correct. It would have been tied to the income qualifier, which reads, and then you have or and, right? It would be the income qualifier, 300% the median income, and either a person that has lived in the community 5 out of the 10 years or 9 out of the 18 is how it currently stands. My amendment would have added qualifiers to the income median qualifier. You could be a person that was arrested or convicted, or you could be a family member, a spouse, a parent, or a child. And as I stated, there are places, in fact, Massachusetts actually did 2 different equity designation definitions. They have one for license and priority, which requires 3 out of the 6, and one for support programs and technical assistance, which requires 1 out of the 5. And the latter is more lenient, but both have race conscious qualifiers, which go even further. And when I say a race conscious qualifier, Massachusetts language, one of the qualifiers is a majority of the ownership is made up of individuals from Black, African American, Hispanic, or Latino descent. So, I mean, they took it even one step further.
But didn't Massachusetts have some real problems with rollout when we're talking about equity? So even if those that language was there, wasn't it still problematic? Is this what Connecticut was trying to avoid?
No, actually, the data and the precedent in other states say otherwise, which really goes to show, who did their homework and who didn't. That was not a problem for them. It hasn't been a problem for other places that have legalized with this as one of the qualifiers. And it is one of the qualifiers. It's not like you have to have this qualifier, but I believe since there was intention, which was quite malicious around the way cannabis was criminalized from the onset, that we should be intentional about the people we're including when we talk about equity, because equity, it requires access. Equity requires reckoning, and as Senator Winfield said, it also requires revenues. So, I mean, all these things come into play, and I just didn't understand the pushback and the narrative around the fact that this would open it up to rich white guys. And I'm like, well, if we talk about the income qualifier, we're talking about 300% of the median income, which is roughly about $237,000 a person can make up to in order to be considered a social equity applicant. I think that opens it up to a lot of white guys. So the intent of the amendment was to really level the playing field in how we see and define equity.
You're hearing State Representative Robyn Porter. Again, she's a Democrat. She worked behind the scenes on an amendment to open up the cannabis sale and operating businesses to even more residents. That amendment ended up not making it through that special session. The governor and others saying that would not be equity. And so there's a lot of argument about what is and is not equity. Representative Porter, you ended up not voting on this bill after all the work that you and others put into it. Why was that?
Actually, there was an emergency that had me away from the campus. Representative Parrott had been taken by ambulance to the hospital. And what some people, or many people, may not know is that I've known him for much longer than he's been in the building. He is like a son to me, and I'm like a second mom to him. And I've been doing this work long enough, Lucy, to realize that, we have to put family first. We have to put, the people that matter most first. And it was a tough decision. Like, we both tussled with it, but at the end of the day, what prevailed was the fact that I needed to be with him and I needed to get him home so that he could rest and I could make sure that he was okay. So that's why I wasn't in the building, and that's why I didn't vote.
How did it make you feel knowing that there was a bipartisan, nearly unanimous vote to strip your amendment out of the bill?
It was disappointing. It was disheartening. I felt like it was a tremendous amount of miscommunication, and I think the thing that really was upsetting to me was, there was this narrative that it was something that the Senate had done, and this is what the Senate does. And I was like, well, actually, House leadership knew about the amendment. In fact, House leadership, drafted the second amendment because there was an initial amendment that Senator Winfield introduced. And then the House came back with an amendment to fix, what he had done. And I was contacted by the majority leader, Jason Rojas, and he asked me to give his chief of staff, Matthew Brockman, or either Paul Mounds a call. So I ended up calling Brockman, and Brockman walked me through, and he said, we just want to make sure that your intent is being carried out correctly, and that what you're trying to do is in fact what's being done. And they crafted a second amendment, and that amendment was taken out before the vote happened in the Senate. So I just wanted to clear the record on that, the House was well aware, House leadership, I should say, was well aware of what was going on around this amendment.
And how is Representative Corey Paris doing, by the way?
He's doing better. Thank you for asking, Lucy. He is doing better. And I'm glad to report that, because gave me quite a scare. So.
Getting back to this bill that's now law, yesterday when I was watching the bill signing, the governor, other lawmakers, and leadership in the General Assembly all calling this a model for the nation. Do you think that this was an accomplishment in the end or a missed opportunity?
I definitely believe it was both. And there were some opportunities that were missed. As hard as we work, there is no perfect bill. There's never a perfect bill. But what I will say is that, thanks to 6377, which was the House bill that I got out of labor in response to the lack of equity in the governor's initial Senate Bill 888, we were able to get quite a bit that wasn't initially on the table. And that was, home grow. We were able to prioritize licensing for equity applicants, taxes that were earmarked for impacted community investment, jobs, for people with criminal histories. The labor peace agreement was really big, the project labor agreement, support for our native tribes, our sisters and brothers out there, and protections for students, which was something that was also very important, was included. So there were some great takeaways, but there was definitely room for improvement. And it was never about it was never about killing the bill. It was about making the bill better. I've heard so much out there, being said on the street about this, but I just want to be clear about that. My intent has always been and will always be, about exercising my moral authority and my political will to represent the people that put me in that building on the strength of what it is that's best for them, in regard to fairness and equity.
You're hearing State Representative Robyn Porter on Zoom here on Where We Live. She's House co-chair of the General Assembly Labor Committee. She's a Democrat who represents parts of New Haven and Hamden. Right now we're talking about the cannabis law here in our state. And if you have questions about next steps, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before I talk more with you about the next steps, including this Equity Council, who will be on it, what decisions they'll make, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with the governor. How would you describe it?
Challenging.
And why is that?
We don't see eye to eye on things, and it's just really, I think, a difference of lived experience and a difference of priorities. And it does make it challenging when you're at the table fighting for the things that matter to people that aren't usually at the table. So I would sum it up. It's a work in progress, and I hope that it's something that has room for improvement. But I have to remain true to who I am and whose I am, and to the people that have entrusted me to be in that building, doing the people's business in the people's house.
The other week when the governor's office released a statement threatening a veto over this amendment, you posted a defiant message on Facebook, quote, "I dare him." Have you had a discussion with him or his staff in the days since?
No, they don't really talk to me. And frankly, they don't want me at the table. And I say that because that's what I've been told by people who are actually at the table. And that's something that I just think really needs to be, we need to be honest about. That is part of the challenge. And I think it comes because I do have strong will and I'm very vocal, but I don't think that's a reason to keep me away from the table. I think it's a reason to have me at the table. So when I say challenging, I mean challenging on every level of doing this work.
You say that they're keeping you away from the table. So when we talk about part of this law requiring equity council, again, that's going to look at this new industry and thinking about ways to help people in communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, who will be involved in this, finding the membership, and what decisions will they make, Representative?
That's a good question. I mean, it will be up to the folks that are outlined in the bill. I mean, like the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, minority folks, the governor's people, they will all have appointees, people that they will appoint to those positions. And it will be critical, it will be crucial who is at that table. And I think that, it should be the entrepreneurs that have expertise around cannabis in this industry. I think it should be the folks that have been disproportionately impacted and criminalized for these cannabis convictions. Those are the folks that I would like to see at the table having some input, because I really believe that, it shouldn't be so heavily, that the involvement shouldn't be so heavy on the government's part, right? On our part. I always say the people closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. So, state agencies should not be regulating, all of this. We should have a commission made of experts, entrepreneurs, people that have been impacted by previous racist drug policies. That's the other thing. Let's talk about it. And that's why I was so adamant about the amendment and including, the folks that have been arrested, because it wasn't just Black folks that were targeted. Like I said, if you go back and the history of it, they called them anti-war people. They called them hippies. They were poor white folks, that also got caught up in this. And I don't think that you can talk about equity without including them. So this whole argument around, the validity of that and inclusion is a little absurd to me.
I understand the governor and some lawmakers have 30 days from passage to make appointments to this council. So will you push this equity council to revisit the equity definition, again, allowing anyone with a marijuana conviction to be eligible, not tying them to a geographic area representative?
Oh, absolutely. I will push them on that. And the other thing that, in the end, I was also harping on that didn't get much media attention was, the expungement piece. The way the bill is currently written, you can only qualify for expungement for 4 ounces or less. And I mean, I grew up an inner city kid, and I can tell you, the dealers that I knew were selling ounces. So they possessed pounds. And if we're talking about expunging and really being equitable about it, I don't think there should be an amount attached to it, since it shouldn't have been criminalized in the first place.
We know that cannabis is a multi-billion-dollar industry. How many licenses to grow and sell could Connecticut actually permit, really?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think that has often been the question of the hour, because I believe it's Oregon that doesn't have any limit, and they've got about 9,000 medicinal licenses going right now. And it's frankly very cheap. You can get a license for, I believe, about $2,500. So I think it all depends on what the objective and the goal is. And there seems to be, like a serious goal around revenues and like raising revenues. So they may limit it, which would be problematic in my book. I think that that's something that over time will play out, and we will be able to make a better assessment around. But I would have liked to have seen the cap increased on licensing.
I guess what I'm wondering is with the way the law is written now, half of all the people who will get licenses will be these social equity applicants. But we know that there are already companies around our country that know the process, that are already operating in other states that are legal. And so how many, small business owners in our state really will benefit from this?
That's a good question. I mean, especially when you talk about the fact that the 4 growers in Connecticut are going to actually be granted a hybrid pathway to automatically enter the adult use industry. And, we've seen in other places where, like Illinois, for instance, after a year, of passing this legislation, they're still struggling with the social equity piece of it. Meanwhile, right, not one Black or brown business, but meanwhile, the white male-owned businesses that took off, they actually have made hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's a real good question, Lucy, and that is a concern.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm speaking again with State Representative Robyn Porter. We were talking about the new cannabis law that the governor signed. Coming up after the break, we're going to hear more about some of the labor issues that Representative Porter worked on with her colleagues in this last session. And you can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today on Zoom, State Representative Robyn Porter, a Democrat House co-chair of the General Assembly Labor Committee. She represents parts of New Haven and Hamden. If you have a question for her, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So I wanted to talk about some of the legislation your committee worked on, Representative. Let's start with pay transparency. This was signed by the governor recently. Tell us more about what this will require employers to do.
This was a big win for us. The disclosure salary range. It actually will, employers will have to make sure that when you apply for a job or prior to being made an offer, that you understand what the salary range is on this job. And that's important because with the disproportionate pay with women, right? The wage gap for women and how we always started out behind the ball. And even as we go on and move up the ladder, we consistently stay behind, losing millions for some of us, Black and brown women, over a 40-year career. So we saw this as something that really needed to be addressed in a way that would be effective in helping to continue our plight to close that pay equity gap.
Understand that the bill requires employers to pay people of different genders the same for, quote, comparable work instead of, quote, equal work. So what difference does that make in the wording, Representative?
Comparable makes the distinction between where we are. You know, there was a time when we addressed this issue because of like factory work and having men on a floor doing the same work as men were doing. But now we know that a lot of that has changed around cafeteria versus janitorial, and the really huge gaps that were being seen between, you know, people doing comparable work and what they were being paid. And I'm talking $5 an hour difference in some instances. So we felt like, you know, changing it to comparable was necessary to address where we've come in the workforce since pay equity has been addressed from early on in the 60s.
The Connecticut Business and Industry Association, or CBIA, they said this law is going to take away employers' freedom to pay more to talented employees. How do you respond to that argument?
I respond by simply saying I don't think that is true. I think that it levels the playing field. I think that, you know, it grants transparency, especially where it's needed, and that it actually helps to build relationships, you know, between employee and employer. And it also gives, you know, disclosure and accountability and transparency to the folks that are working there. You know, I think that everybody deserves to be on a level playing field. And this is a tool that helps us get there. And I believe that it's good for business and it's good for the workers. I think it's a win-win for everyone.
Let's also talk about workers' compensation. There were labor committee bills that would have given more generous workers' compensation benefits to essential employees who got sick during the pandemic that failed to make it into law this session. But I believe there was a last-minute provision in the budget bill that created a $34 million assistance program for essential employees. Tell us about, were you involved in the creation of this fund, Representative?
Absolutely. This was near and dear. I mean, for the fact that it was for our essential workers, but especially because of Denise and Howard Rogers, who are two of my constituents out of Hampton, unfortunately, both contracted COVID, and Howard ended up passing, Denise's husband. So this became something that me and Senator Kushner took on early on in the pandemic last year in March when all this stuff started happening. So the bill actually does create a $34 million, what we're calling an essential workers COVID-19 assistance program for certain essential workers who couldn't work due to contracting COVID or having the symptoms. So that the fund is going to be administered by the state comptroller. And it's going to be, which is important, first come, first serve basis to healthcare personnel, firefighters, police officers, correction officers, food, agricultural workers, manufacturing workers, et cetera. And I think that's going to be really important because I know Denise is sitting on thousands of dollars worth of hospital bills. We also addressed the death benefit in here, where it's currently $4,000, and it has been that since 1987. So we've increased that, and some of that will be taken out of this fund in order to help people cover burial in the unfortunate circumstance that someone passes from COVID.
You said first come, first serve. It's a $34 million assistance program. Any concern that you may run out of funds to help people who need it, these essential workers?
Yes, there's always the concern that we're going to run out of money, but I'm hoping that we will be back at this and be able to put more money in the fund as we move forward with the federal funding that's coming available in the ARC.
Again, you're hearing State Representative Robyn Porter, who represents parts of New Haven and Hamden. She is co-chair of the Labor Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So we talked about some successes, but you were also working towards what was called the Fair Work Week bill. It passed the Senate, but it came up short for a vote in the House. Tell us what this bill would have required and why it didn't make it through, Representative.
Well, Fair Work Week, like we know that low wage workers are what we call on shift call scheduling, which makes it really hard for people to plan around doctor's appointments and childcare and just life in general. And most of these workers are women, predominantly Black and brown women. And this has been something that we've been trying to do for years to address the fact that, people have a budget. You know what it is that you're going to need in order to sustain your household. And you can't do that not knowing what your work hours are going to be from week to week. And this bill was an effort to address that. It's been done several places, so this isn't anything new that we were trying to do. And we have made concessions in order to make the bill palatable, but unfortunately, it did not make it out of the House. So that will definitely be a bill that we come back to next year in the short session to make another effort to get through the General Assembly.
The earlier bill that we just talked about, the workers' compensation bill, that actually got through, I believe, through the budget bill or the implementer bill. Some people criticized this way that lawmakers, get things through that have not been approved earlier. Can you talk about this strategy and, address the critics of why this is not necessarily a good way of making programs and laws, Representative?
There's always that argument that is made, and the implementer is really to implement the budget and to also deal with bills that didn't make it through the final process of both chambers. So it's not necessarily that these bills haven't been heard or had a public hearing, because they have. It's just the way that things have been done. I've been in the building 7 years. They've been done like that way before I got there. So whether I like it or not, that is a part of the process. This is nothing new, and this is how business is done, and not just in the state of Connecticut. But I will say there was another bill that I'm really proud of, which was the domestic workers bill that got through the implementer, which addresses the fact that domestic workers have historically been left out of workers' rights provisions in law, and the fact that they are supposed to be paid minimum wage, and a lot of them don't know that. So this would actually provide them with funding to educate domestic workers on what their rights are and the fact that they should be paid overtime, and to address the tremendous amount of wage theft that goes on within this industry.
We've been talking about some of the bills that you've worked on, some of the bills that have become law. When you look back at this session, Democrats hold the majority in both chambers. We've got a Democrat in the governor's office. Do you see this as a successful session, Representative? Were there issues that you hoped that would have been raised and passed, given the majority?
Yes, I do see this as a successful session. I mean, we talked about a few of the labor bills, but I mean, the first bill out the gate for me was part of history. It was historical. We were the eighth state and the first in 2021 to pass the Crown Act. We also passed a bill to deal with the experience rate that would benefit especially businesses, but especially small businesses, where they wouldn't be held liable because unemployment was due to the pandemic and not to them laying people off. The other bill that I was really proud of was the PTSI bill. It was an expansion on PTSI, first to change it from post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury, because it is an injury to the mind, a mental injury. And we expanded that, Lucy, to include all DOC workers, our dispatchers who are on the front lines as first responders, and also particular healthcare workers. So that was something that was a big deal. The Janus bill, right, to address the right of workers and employees to organize and unionize, and the disparity study, that was a big one as well. Something we've been trying to do for quite a while, around making an assessment around small minority businesses and contracting, and how that is not equally, put out there for the minority businesses to access.
But Democrats didn't get everything they wanted. There was a group of Democrats that you included that wanted to see, hikes on the amount of taxes that the wealthy pay in our state. In turn, that money to help low-income residents. How do you describe this process with the governor, again, with the final budget, and what you hope to see in this next session?
Well, it was certainly a missed opportunity to bring tax equity and fairness to the state. And, we coined it a recovery for all, because, some people have done very well during this pandemic, but the majority of us have not. And I just believe that, the things that were being suggested, around closing that gap and making sure that people are paying their fair share was an outright refusal to even, have a discussion around it. And I thought that was very unfortunate, because we know what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's something a fifth grader could figure out. The more money you make, the more taxes you should pay. And when we talk about wealth, we know that is not income. So we have to look at investments in a way that we allow people to claim tax credits and, corporate welfare. We demonize people that are on welfare, quote unquote, right? Food stamps and cash assistance, but we don't address the runaway inequality, not just in this state, but nationally. So that was a great disappointment that we weren't able to move him on that issue. But we are persistent. We are not going away, and we will continue to fight that good fight.
Before we end, I have to ask, what this last session has been like for you personally, with everyone dealing with this pandemic, business, the way you do your work, obviously having to change with restrictions. I'm just wondering if you can talk about, personally, how you've navigated this the last year.
Oh, with a whole lot of prayer. I never thought in a million years I would be doing this work. And I've often felt, or suffered from imposter syndrome. And the one thing that I believe God is really, tried to help me to understand in doing the work is that it's not what I'm learning in the building, it's what I bring to the building. And that is, exceptional in many ways, which makes it a different fight for me, So personally, I've been under a lot of, pressure and a lot of stress to get the work done, feeling like I'm constantly having to fight, fights and battles that I shouldn't have to, with people I shouldn't have to. So it's been challenging, but at the end of the day, I always focus on my purpose in that building and why I was chosen, because I believe I was chosen. Many are called, but few are chosen to be in the building. So I try to maintain myself according to, the assignment. And the pandemic made it very challenging. And the thing that I really didn't understand, especially towards the end of the session, was why the governor didn't choose to open the building. I mean, like, it's the people's house, it's the people's business, but the people were missing, and we had press in the building and other folks. And I'm just like, that was a disappointment. Like, I really felt like at one point we should have opened the building and allowed people to come in and conduct business in a way that I feel would have been more transparent and more effective. So the things that we didn't get done, I think, had something to do with the fact that we were secluded and that building was closed off. And unfortunately, the public didn't have access in a way that I think was meaningful. I do thank God for Zoom, because it did allow people that normally wouldn't be able to make the trip to Hartford or participate in public hearings or committee meetings to be present. But it also locked out the people that, customarily have access to us, immediate access, right? You're getting texts and phone calls. People aren't getting you. You're not getting people, but it's hard. It's easier when you can run into somebody in the building, have lunch with them in the cafeteria, talk to them in the elevator, catch them after a meeting, catch them in the hallway. So the magic of the building really was not there this year. And I'm hopeful and I'm prayerful that will not be the case in our next session, 2022.
Well, I want to thank State Representative Robyn Porter for joining us here on Where We Live. Just wanted to mention Cody on Facebook wrote that he appreciates your compassion and work on cannabis, and also says she legit gives the best hugs ever.
Yeah, I'm known for being a hugger.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. It's always a pleasure to be in your presence, and I do appreciate it.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up, we're going to get analysis from Hartford Courant columnist Kevin Rennie, and also talk about the selection of a new Republican Party chairman in our state. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Joining us now on Zoom is Kevin Rennie, Hartford Courant columnist, a former state lawmaker. He blogs at dailyrunctions.com. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Lucy.
I wanted to ask you before we talk about the state GOP party and who is the new chair, what was your reaction to what State Representative Robyn Porter shared, including that she told us the governor's office does not want her at the table? Is that unusual to hear from a lawmaker about a governor in her own party?
It is. Members of the same party as the governor, in this case the Democrats, usually pretty careful about their public, or circumspect about their public statements on the governor, and so that is unusual. But she's carving out her own lane in the legislature, and by her own description, she's getting a lot of what she hopes to accomplish. So she has learned how to get around that hostility, and not every legislator who thinks they should be at the table is going to be at the table. That's just the nature of how the legislature works with the governor, and really even among themselves. There are on some issues members who are leaders, and there are others who become rank and file. And when they get to negotiating, usually they want people at the table who they feel can lead to a result that'll bring a bill to the floor that the legislature can pass, and the governor can sign. I think she was wrong about who decides whether or not the public was going to be allowed into the Capitol. I believe that the leaders of the House and the Senate have authority over the operation of the Capitol and certainly the Legislative Office building. I don't think that's the governor's decision.
Thank you for that clarification, Kevin. You've written about the whole process behind the cannabis bill. You described it as chaotic, shrouded in secrecy. So what do you see as some potential problems with the system for awarding licenses for sellers and growers? I understand, originally they were thinking starting May 2022, you'd see retail opening, but now it's getting moved even further back. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a complicated process. It's expensive to open a business like this. And so people are going to need financial backers and investors. It's highly regulated, and state government plays a big part in it. And it is, in many places, often susceptible to political influence and the doling out of political favors. I recall, I think in Massachusetts, they had to scrap the first round of licenses, or the process, because there was so much political influence, and it was a mess. The stakes are high. People have visions of making fortunes. Not everybody does in the marijuana business. There is money to be made, but there's plenty of money to be lost, and so we'll have to rely on a really skillful regulatory system that is free of political influence. That's difficult to create in a system that appears to be, even in the drafting of the bill, had there was a lot of interest in favoring some people over others.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see who sits on this equity council. Members being picked pretty soon.
Well, and also, just to go back to your previous point, this was the whole issue of legalizing marijuana for recreational use. It has been a public issue for a long time. Don't wait till the last 2 weeks of the legislative session to reveal the proposal. It's just as that, in many ways, is quite anti-democratic, and it is an invitation to trouble.
Let's move on to the state Republican Party. They picked a new chair. Who is it?
It is Ben Proto, a Republican operative of many years from Stratford.
Any surprises in this choice?
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Any surprises in this choice?
That he won by such a large margin on the first ballot was a surprise. There had been 4 candidates initially, and one of them, Jennifer Casado of Florida, was ruled ineligible because she was not a registered to vote in Connecticut. So that left 3 candidates, and that was to the advantage of Ben Proto, who may have been a lot of people's second choice, or whatever support she had. That Ben Proto may have been their second choice when they couldn't go to her, couldn't vote for her. And then also, as there is after the roll is called, he had enough to win. But there is the treachery round of conventions and roll call votes like this, where you get a chance to change after you see the lay of the land. It was clear he was going to win, and then I think 14 more votes switched, largely from Jim Campbell of Westport to Ben Proto. Why people do that, it's always been a mystery to me.
We just have a couple of minutes left, but what does this choice mean for the future of the state GOP? Kevin, this is a question that everyone's been asking, right? Ever since President Trump left office. What does it mean for Republicans here who've seen membership?
That's the essential question, isn't it? I mean, Ben Proto is sort of an example of the terrible path that the Republican Party has taken. He was a big enthusiastic supporter of John McCain in 2000 and 2008, and by 2016 he was the state chairman of the Trump campaign. So I am not sure what it means in terms of ideology and beliefs. He will have an opportunity to show his skill, because also yesterday, State Senator Alex Kasser of Greenwich resigned from the state Senate. She's a Democrat, first Democrat to win that seat in almost 90 years in 2018, and reelected in 2020. That's going to create a special election because she resigned yesterday instead of at the beginning of July. Special election has to be this summer. It's an opportunity for Ben Proto to put a pretty big victory on the board in that election. If he can't, if the Republicans can't win that seat back in a special election, that tells a pretty grim tale for them.
Who could be some potential candidates in that race?
The candidate who ran in 2020, a Greenwich Republican named Ryan Fazio, I think he's interested. I haven't checked the news this morning, but he was a very enthusiastic, hardworking candidate, impressed a lot of people, came close in November. So he would be a natural candidate. There are a couple of Republican state representatives in Greenwich, which has the bulk of the delegates and the voters. So they may be interested because they won't have to give anything up, and they don't have to give up any office in a special summer election to run for the state Senate. But the delegates, there's no primary allowed in a special election in Connecticut. The delegates who gather to choose the nominee are the delegates from the convention last year. So they may be predisposed to supporting the candidate they did last year. They may already be, they may be that person's supporters, because in these conventions, when you know you're going to be the candidate, you often try to have your friends be named as the delegates, so you're sure they'll show up for the convention, cast their vote for it. So they'll get to do it again.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this special state Senate election this summer. Kevin, Rennie, thank you for joining us. And of course, I'll be interested to see some Republican hopefuls in this governor's race coming up. Before we know it, we'll be sure to have you back to talk about that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Kevin is a Hartford Courant columnist. You can read his blog. We'll tweet it out at Where We Live. And he's, of course, a former state lawmaker. That's Kevin Rennie. Today's show produced by Matt Dwyer with help from Robyn Doyen-Aiken. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor.